where destiny with men for pieces plays.
The words of an 11th century Persian Omar Khayyam. In the West, his poetry made him a household name.
It became the most famous book of poetry in the English language.
Americans immediately embraced the Rubaiyat.
Omar Khayyam is right to move in finger rights and having writ moves on.
Nor all your piety nor wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line.
زندگی کن. قدر این دنیا تو بدون. تو چی میدونی که بعدش چیزی هست یا نیست؟
But he was also a formidable scientist.
I think his greatest achievement in astronomy was to get an incredibly accurate measurement for the length of the tropical year.
And a calendar so accurate it's still in use today. This is the story of an intellectual giant whose legacy stretches into the 21st century. I've always been attracted to his poetry and his philosophy. Now I'm going on a journey to find out more about Omar Khayyam and his place in the world today. Abul Fath Umar ibn Ibrahim Khayyam was born in Persia in the city of Nishabur in 1048 in the province of Khorasan. Here, east met west on the Silk Route and the gateway to the ancient civilizations of China and India. This is Nishabur's Omar Khayyam High School, where they are starting the National Day of Celebration of Omar Khayyam's life.
امثال اینها رو داشته باشه و انشالله کثر الله امثالهم این صلوات مجدد.
The original city was destroyed by a series of earthquakes and later by the Mongol invasion. Only the remains of medieval Nishabur exist today. What kind of city was Nishabur?
It's a very large city. I think no one can say quite how large, but by the standards I would have thought of any city in Europe at the period except Constantinople.
In 1040, Persia was invaded from the east by nomadic tribal Turks known as the Seljuks. They defeated the existing rulers and made Nishabur the first capital of their new empire.
They came in substantial but not overwhelming numbers. They came already converted to Islam. They knew what cities and settled agriculture were like, and they did not come to destroy.
At the time of Omar Khayyam, the ruling king Malik Shah and his chief minister Nizam al-Mulk opened colleges across the empire. Most important were the Nizamiye, where some of the finest scholars impressed young minds. Omar Khayyam was one such student.
استادان از سراسر جهان اینجا میان برای به فیض رسوندن دانشیان از سراسر جهان اینجا میان و نام نیشابور را به عنوان افتخار به دنبال اسمشون یدک میکشن و به شهر دیار خودشون میبرن. بر تقدیر زمان خیام اوج اقتدار و عظمت فرهنگی نیشابور تلقی میشه و خیام در این زمان درخشید در مدارس نظامیه و تحت درس خوندن تحت استفاده از فیوزات امام الحرمین که یک از شخصیت‌های بلند پایه جهان اسلام بود به این درجه و مقام میرسه به گونه‌ای که بعد می‌بینیم نامشو بر یک از حفره‌های کره ماه می‌گذارن یا یکی از اقمار سیارک‌های منظومه شمسی رو به نام این شخصیتی نامگذاری می‌کنن که از این شهر برخاست و نام نیشابور رو بلند آوازه کرد.
What kind of ruler was Malik Shah? Do we know much about him?
His period of rule is a kind of partnership between the great Persian bureaucrat and the Seljuk ruler. Omar Khayyam comes to court and becomes a very close intimate of Malik Shah. The word used for such courtiers is Nadim, and Omar Khayyam is clearly that. And it's not just that he's a nice person to have a drink with, but because he has skills and knowledge that are of value to the ruler.
At the remains of a palace in old Neshabur, I come across a man whose performance of Omar Khayyam's poetry has made him something of a local celebrity.
شما خودتون از کی به خیام علاقه‌مند شدید؟
من 12-13 سال بیشتر نه. من تا 60 سالگی که نمیخوندم. میخوندم اما تو خیام بیام، تو تهران برم. با 7000 سالگار سر به سری، خدای من، محبوب من، امید من، یا اینم به سلامتی خدا.
Nearly 900 years after his death, Omar Khayyam's name can be seen everywhere in the streets of modern-day Tehran. Even one of the metro stations is named after him. I'm going to see a man who knows a lot about Omar Khayyam. He has written a book about Khayyam known as May and Mina, which means wine and the wine glass. He also edits a very famous literary magazine known as Bukhara. His name is Ali Dehbashi. He's very respected in Iran's literary community. سلام علیکم. به آقای دهباشی. حال شما چطوره؟ خوب هستین؟
ایده ما روشن.
قربون شما، خوب هستین؟ خیلی ممنون. شما چطور شد که این کتاب قطور می و مینا رو سراغش رفتید و در مورد خیاط چاپ کردید؟
اصلا من هم در پاسخ در واقع به کنجکاوی‌های خودم اول که چرا اینقدر همه خیام میخونم، مهمترین مقالات در چند زمینه از زندگی خیام، یکی اندیشه ها، شعرش، مسائل ریاضی و آنچه که غربی ها دربارش گفتن. سعی کردم با توی حجم اینجوری 700 صفحه‌ای یه تصوری از آنچه که خیام میتونسته باشه به دست بدم. توانسته به اعماق روح انسانی دست پیدا کنه و روی نکاتی دست بذاره که این مربوط به دردها و آمال انسانی در طول هزاران سال باشه و این دردها تغییری نکرده از یک جهت.
His universal sentiments made Khayyam popular in the West. In the summer of 2009, academics and scholars from across the world gathered at the University of Cambridge to celebrate Omar Khayyam. At the post-conference garden party, I meet Sir Nicholas Barrington, a trustee of the Ancient India and Iran Trust.
شما از خیام چیزی شعر بلد هستین؟
Well, why not? Why not? Yes.
چی بلدین از خیام شما؟
What is it? یارم چه به اتفاق دیدار کنید، باید ز دوست یاد بسیار کنید. چون باده گوشگوار نوشید به هم، نوبت که به ما رسد نگونسار کنید.
The man who made Omar Khayyam's poetry famous in the West was a reclusive man of letters, Edward Fitzgerald, whose circle of friends included literary giants Alfred Lord Tennyson and William Makepeace Thackeray.
Fitzgerald came from a very wealthy
Anglo-Irish family, and it's said that his parents were some of the richest people in England. And he had a privileged and, so to speak, rather idle life. He went to Cambridge and he never had a job, never had a profession. He was what the Victorians would have recognized as a bachelor. The main emotional center of his life was friendship, almost always with men. And he became friends with a young, self-taught linguist called Edward Cowell. And he knew Cowell when he was in his late 30s, and Cowell was 18 or 19.
Edward Cowell was studying classics at Oxford when he came across a rare manuscript of Persian poetry in the Bodleian Library. It's still there today, and I'm looking forward to seeing it. So, Robert, is this the book which Edward Fitzgerald translated into English?
Yes, it is the actual manuscript that he used for his translation.
This little book?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I can see here. It's written in Persian, Hakim Omar Khayyam. So is this book, as far as you're concerned, in good condition now?
It's in very good condition for its age, considering that it was produced in about 1460.
1460?
Yes.
So this is about 550 years old.
Yes.
Robert, I can see one of the rubaiyat here, which is one of my favorites.
Yes.
در کارگه کوزه‌گری رفتم دوش دیدم 2000 کوزه گویا و خموش ناگاه یکی کوزه برآورد خروش کوزه‌گر و کوزه‌خر و کوزه فروش. To be honest with you, I don't know how Fitzgerald managed to translate this into English. I mean, if you ask me what he says, I can't translate it for you. Really? Honestly. In the middle of the 19th century, how Fitzgerald, with his limited Persian, was able to translate this into English and makes Rubaiyat one of the most famous books in the world, I don't know how he did that. He must have been a genius. Soon after finding Omar Khayyam's manuscript, Cowell moved to India.
A few months after Cowell left England for Calcutta, Fitzgerald made his brief and disastrous marriage. He married a woman called Lucy Barton, who was the daughter of an old friend of his. The translation of the Rubaiyat belongs to this period in which Fitzgerald is, so to speak, doubly afflicted, first by the departure of Edward Cowell for India, and then by the trauma, if you like, of his marriage.
'Tis all a checkerboard of nights and days, where destiny with men for pieces plays. Hither and thither moves and mates and slays, and one by one back in the closet lays.
In this bleak frame of mind, Fitzgerald began to translate Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat. And like many sins, he found a kindred spirit in this 11th century Persian.
تردیدی نیست اون وجه خیام که در جهان مورد توجه هست برمیگرده به این زمینه از شناخت خیام از انسان و تنهایی ها و اون درون پیچیده و چنگانه‌ای که از خودش نسبت به مسائل مختلف ابراز میکنه، متأثر میشه و این رو بیان میکنه.
In 1070, Khayyam moved to Samarkand, one of the oldest cities in Central Asia. Here he wrote his most important and influential mathematical works. I meet mathematician Marcus du Sautoy to find out what Khayyam discovered. At the time of Omar Khayyam, when he started his works, what was the situation in the world as far as mathematics was concerned?
Well, I think most people actually thought that mathematics was created by the ancient Greeks and then stopped when the ancient Greek Empire disbanded, and that nothing happened until Europeans sort of got back in the game in the 13th, 14th century. But actually, there was a huge amount of mathematics which was happening in the East, in China, India, and the Muslim world, and in Persia too. and in particular the development of a new language called algebra.
And the Westerners at that time didn't know about these developments in the East?
I think the East have been a little bit written out of the history of mathematics, and we're only really recovering now the great achievements that were done in the East.
In your opinion, what was Omar Khayyam's main achievements in mathematics?
I think his main achievement was studying something called the cubic equation. It's a little bit like a cryptic crossword. I'm thinking of a number, okay? If I square this number and add 1 to it, you get the number 17. Yes. Okay, so what was the number I was first thinking of?
I'm very poor.
So
again.
I square a number.
Yes.
I add 1 to it, and
4.
I get 70. Very good.
Yes,
exactly.
4.
So you've undone that little cryptic crossword about this unknown number that I was thinking of.
Yes.
So that's actually an example of a quadratic, because I was squaring the number. But what Omar Khayyam was interested in is, okay, what if the number is actually cubed? Can you work backwards and understand what the number was that I'm thinking about? Now, why is this important? Well, to understand these equations gave you access to things like measuring the area of a field or the volume of a box.
Right.
What Omar Khayyam was trying to do was to find, is there some formula which can help me to undo the cubic and understand how to solve those? How to work out what is that unknown number? He didn't manage to solve this problem. It frustrated him, but he got a partial solution to it. And it's a rather nice solution, because what he did was to change algebra into geometry. So to show you his achievement, what I want to do is try and draw something on the floor for you to show you how he tried to solve this equation. So this is going to be my x and y coordinates. So I'm going to draw a graph here. These cubic equations, they produce a sort of shape which has sort of 2 curves inside them, a bit like this. It goes up and then down again. And above here, the graph is producing positive numbers. Below here, it's producing negative numbers.
Indeed.
What Omar Khayyam was trying to work out is, where is the height of this graph 0? So he was trying to calculate this distance here.
Right.
And he couldn't produce a formula for it. So he changed the equation for the cubic actually into something slightly simpler, an equation for a quadratic. And then he took a circle, another fundamental mathematical object.
Right.
So here's the circle. And he realized that the solution to the cubic equation was actually the distance between the x-axis and where the quadratic cuts the circle. So he realized this distance here would solve the cubic equation. And he was excited by that because it reduced a complicated thing about cubics to 2 simpler shapes.
Yes.
But still, he was frustrated that he didn't have a formula which would give him the answer.
Right.
And he wrote, maybe it will be future generations that will come up with this magic formula. And indeed, it was the Europeans who eventually picked up the baton from Omar Khayyam and did eventually come up with this formula.
Do you think there is a link between his rubaiyat and his mathematical mind?
Absolutely. I think, I mean, people might find it rather unexpected. Poetry and maths, what have they got to do with each other? I think he was sympathetic to sort of patterns in language and poetry, partly because that's what he was doing in his mathematical time as well.
I am interested to learn not just how advanced Khayyam was in mathematics, but also how maths and poetry and music go hand in hand. I'm going to meet Muhammad Reza Shajarian, a living legend in Iran, where he's considered one of the masters of traditional Persian music. این ساز شما ساختید آقای؟
آره.
از ساختهای شماست؟
آره، ابداع منه. ابداع من هست.
از ابداعتونه.
این 4 اکتاو و نیم چیزشه، وسعتشه.
بله.
از نوت 30 اکتاو دوم پیانو.
بله.
تا نوت سول اکتاو ششم پیانو رو داره. موسیقی که خب بخشی از زندگی ماست، بخشی از یعنی اون جوهر زبان ماست و مردمان ما مردمان فهمیده ایه. خیام رو میشناسن، درکش میکنن، منتها حرف نمیزن، ولی جاریه در زندگی مردم. خیام همچنان جاری. از خیام وام میگیریم و حرف میزنیم و با زبان خیام هنرمون رو ارائه میکنیم، از آهنگساز گرفته تا خواننده.
Over 30 years ago, Shajarian recorded an album of Omar Khayyam's poetry. It's still a bestseller today.
خیام به عنوان یک شاعر برای شما چقدر اهمیت داره که شما 30 و اندی سال پیش رباعیات خیام رو خوندید؟ خیام چقدر برای شما مهمه؟
اون موقعی که شروع کردم خیام رو خوندن، واقعا خیام رو چون خیلی دوستش دارم و دوستش داشتم، بعد هم که آهنگساز کار کرده بود رو شعراش دیدم خوب کار کرده، اینه که همکاری کردیم و من برنامه رو خوندم و خیلی هم موفق بود. می نوش که عمر جاودانی اینه، خود حاصلت از دور جوانی اینه، هنگام گل و مل است و یاران سرمست، خوش باش دمی که زندگانی اینه، خوش باش دمی که زندگانی اینه. یادم رفته.
بسیار عالی.
هنگام گل و مل است و یاران سرمست، خوش باش دمی که زندگانی این است.
می خوردن و شاد بودن آیین من است، فارغ بودن ز کفر و دین من است. گفتم به عروس دهر کابین تو چیست؟ گفتا دل خرم تو کابین من است. شما موقعی که یه خورده غور میکنین تو رباعیات میبینین دو جنبه هست. یه وجهی سلبیه، میگه این همیشه هیچ در هیچ هست، این زندگی فانی است، آغاز نداره و فانوس خیال و اینا. یه وجه ایجابیه، میگه مواظب باشین، هوشیار باشین، دم رو دریابین، هی هشدار میده.
Make the most of what we yet may spend, before we too into the dust descend. Dust into dust, and under dust to lie. Sans wine, sans song, sans singer, and sans end.
Omar Khayyam's poetry was no doubt influenced by his work as an astronomer. It was this ability that would lead to his greatest achievement, to reform the lunar calendar. I've come to the Royal Observatory in London to find out why Malik Shah needed to do this.
There he was celebrating the spring festival, and it was winter.
I see.
And he thought there's something wrong here. And the problem was, at the time, they were using a moon-based calendar. Now, they had to have 12 months in the lunar year, and this meant that they had a year which was 354 days long. Well, it's not, it's 365 days long, so gradually it drifted away. What really brought it to the point where they needed to change was you pay your taxes after you've harvested the crop. That's
Right.
how they know how much you owe.
Yes.
Well, of course, in some years, unscrupulous tax collectors were trying to claim 2 lots of tax because you've got the shorter year. And in other years, they were turning around and saying to Malik Shah, there's no tax this year. And he liked that even less.
Yeah.
In the early 1070s, Malik Shah founded an observatory in Isfahan, where over a period of 8 years, Omar Khayyam and his fellow astronomers studied the movements of the heavens. To calculate the lengths of the year, the astronomers studied the night sky. most stars stay fixed relative to each other, but the planets and the sun change positions daily. Relative to the stars, the sun moves in a circular path. In 1 year, it goes full circle. The astronomers use certain stars as reference points. These became known as the signs of the zodiac. Over the year, the astronomers watched the sun's movement and calculated the exact time it took to move from one sign of the zodiac to the next. These became the months. In this painstaking way, Khayyam was able to calculate the exact time it took for the sun to make a full circle, a year.
When he had finished, he came up with the length for the solar year, which is incredibly accurate. Now, in actual fact, he slightly overdid it because he was quoting a year to 12 decimal places, but he was right to the 5th digit. The 6th digit is one that actually is where the Earth is not as accurate as Omar Khayyam.
Khayyam's calendar was even more accurate than the Gregorian calendar, which came into use in Europe 500 years later. So how was he able to make such accurate calculations?
They were building on the legacy of the Greeks. You have got to observe very accurately, you've got to be very reliable, very careful, and you must have the really good instruments. And of course, the astrolabe was an absolutely superb instrument, right at the peak of its technology at that time.
Could you show me how does an astrolabe work, please?
Oh, this is the absolute cutting-edge laptop of its time. You just can't believe how beautiful and how perfect an instrument this is.
Oh my God, look at this.
Oh, that
There's
is
so
beautiful.
much information here. What are all these?
Yes, well, my problem is I don't read Arabic, but there is absolutely everything the astronomer on the go could want.
I can see, for instance, here, name of stars in Arabic and Persian, like Merrikh, which is for Mars, or Shams, which is for the sun itself, and other names. And also I can see the name of 4 cities here: Baghdad, Basra, Isfahan, where Omar Khayyam, of course you mentioned, was calculating the length of the year, and Tus, which is also another city in Iran.
An astrolabe can be used to measure the elevation of the sun, and from that it's possible to calculate the time of day.
You've got quadrants here, which would be your tables for the star calculating altitudes. They would actually relate to the star and sun coordinates. So that once you've measured your altitude of the sun, you would use these tables and numbers to actually then find out what time of day it was. And that was the vital piece of information you needed for your setting up your calendar.
Khayyam's work on the new Jalali calendar, named after Jalaluddin Malik Shah, made him the most respected astronomer at the royal court. In the West, he is famous for his rubaiyat, 4-line poems which Edward Fitzgerald translated and published.
These books lay in the bookseller's shop. Nobody bought a single one. They cost a certain amount. He reduced them to 1 shilling, small amount. Nobody bought them. He reduced them to 1 penny, the smallest coin of the realm. And he put them in a box outside his shop, and nobody bought them. Now, I am certainly surprised that nobody had enough perception to read these poems and see how good they were. But since everyone else had failed to notice that, I'm astonished that one man did. A man called Whitley Stokes, who was an editor, stopped outside the shop, looked through this penny box, took out a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, read it, and said, "My stars, this is good poetry. This is good poetry." And he walked into the shop, bought some more copies, sent them to his friends, and that was the rocket went up.
Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat became a publishing sensation and entered the bloodstream of popular culture. Omar Khayyam dining clubs sprang up dedicated to Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat. The London club is still going strong, and I met two of its members to find out why.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this club. And I'm so pleased to be here really today because as a Persian, as a great admirer of Omar Khayyam, I am so happy to see two members of the Omar Khayyam Club still celebrating his life after 900 years. I mean, what is the interest in Omar Khayyam and Fitzgerald?
Well, it was very fashionable to have dining clubs dedicated to, and there was authors. It was a Pepys Club, which still I believe exists. There was one devoted to Thackeray, and one devoted to Dickens, and so on and so forth.
The dinners, with the wonderful menus that we still produce, are a wonderful vehicle for us to have an evening of fun, but one that actually looks back seriously at both Omar Khayyam and Fitzgerald.
And when was the club first founded?
Well, in the early 1890s. The first formal dinner of the club was in 1893.
Could you tell me what usually happened at your dinners?
We meet twice a year, so we have a spring dinner and an autumn dinner. We stick with the same format that we've always had. So we have a wonderful menu, and a cartoonist will have been asked by the secretary, which happens to be me, to make a drawing.
What sort of food do you eat at these dinners?
I suppose that's the biggest difference. If you look at some of the menus, the early
How old is
menus,
that
well,
menu
this
in
is
your hand?
1901, so this is a 7-course menu: hors d'oeuvre, consommé, salmon, lamb, on and on. It's certainly much grander than the menu that we would have now.
Roger, do you allow women to become members
I'm
of the
afraid
club?
not.
Why not? Omar Khayyam wouldn't be happy to hear that.
I think it is a great pity, yes, exactly.
What sort of people were attracted to the club?
Well, practically every writer of any note, basically. Conan Doyle, Henry James, Thomas Hardy, A. Houseman, J.M. Barrie. You know, it's just a roll call of all the leading writers of the time, basically.
And they would gather to discuss literature and poetry and Omar Khayyam, Fitzgerald, and have fun.
Yeah, very much have fun, I think.
America too had an Omar Khayyam club. The Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas in Austin holds one of the largest collections of Rubaiyat materials in the world.
Here we have the Omar Khayyam Club of America. The Americans had to have their Omar Khayyam Club, just like the British, so a few years later they founded one. And these are some of the souvenir menus. As you can see, they're celebrating this sort of vaguely Eastern aesthetic that they've assigned to the Rubaiyat. And at the back of each menu are signed the names of those in attendance at the meal, and all done up to make them all feel very special about their connection to Omar. This is the first edition of Edward Fitzgerald's translation of the Rubaiyat, and it is one of the great rarities of 19th century British poetry.
Right.
Fitzgerald had to pay to have it published by Bernard Quaritch, and he didn't even put his name on the cover. And as you can see, it's a small, not particularly impressive volume. The Rubaiyat spawned all sorts of products,
Right.
some of which have absolutely no relationship to the poet.
Yes.
For example, Omar tooth powder, which you could buy in England. I don't really get what the connection is. You could also buy the game of the Rubaiyat, which is just a standard set of playing cards, each suit represented by a different translator. And this is a wonderful program from a performance of the biographical play Omar the Tent Maker.
It was called the tent maker because Khayyam in Persian means the tent maker.
Exactly. So he was commonly known in the popular culture as Omar the Tent Maker.
It is interesting that usually it is referred to him as Omar by his first name in America.
Yes, I think it's quite significant.
Yes.
There's a kind of familiarity
Yes.
with this 11th century poet that,
Right.
that is surprising looking
Yes.
back at it now. I think there was a sense that this poet was speaking directly to you.
The ball no question makes of eyes and nose, but right or left as strikes the player goes. And he that tossed thee down into the field, he knows about it all. He knows. He knows.
Janet Davis is Professor of American Studies.
Omar Khayyam in the United States was a sensation and was very much part and parcel in a way to the cultural changes, the explosive array of changes occurring in the United States in the late 19th century and early 20th century.
And how was it that Omar Khayyam entered into the popular culture there?
Americans seized upon the kind of the impulses of live for the moment, the emphasis upon material pleasure, and an emphasis on fate and a world that is uncertain. And interestingly, a text that starts out as a kind of high cultural product becomes quickly massified.
This is one of my other favorite items. This little copy was purchased in Cairo
Yeah, I can see Cairo.
by a soldier in the British Army during World War I in 1917. And he has gone through this copy, which he could have fit in his rucksack, and he's underlined all the passages about the inevitability of death. And it reminds you how important the philosophy of the Rubaiyat was to its readers at the time. It's a very important window through which to view World War I.
In some ways, it has become indivisible from a broader American way of life and thinking. But there is a tendency to forget history in the ways in which contemporary geopolitical problems have overshadowed our cultural memory of a Persian astronomer, poet, and mathematician who was the product of an incredibly cosmopolitan medieval Persian world that Americans today, in a kind of polarity of Islam and Christianity as an inevitable clash, have simply forgotten.
During the 19th century, the Rubaiyat became one of the most famous poems in the world. But why did it capture the public imagination?
The very sentiments that Omar Khayyam is dealing with, which are so attractively put into English poetry, they speak to all of us. They're about the human condition and human sensitivity. Life is short, and we feel the poignant irony and the pain of the knowledge that we haven't got long to live. So let's enjoy it. Let's maximize our pleasures. By the way, we'll have another glass of wine while we're talking. A book of verses underneath the bough, a jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou beside me singing in the wilderness. Ah, wilderness were paradise enow.
ما در دنیای زندگی میکنیم که نه آغازی داره نه پایانی داره. آنچه که ما میبینیم تکرار مکرراته، تکرار موقعیتایی است که ای جنون آمیز تکرار میشن و زمان رو ایجاد میکنن. توجه میکنیم و این ملال زندگی از اینجا سرچشمه میگیره و تمام کوشش خیام اینه که از این تسلسل بگریزه، دم رو دریابه. در تفکر خیام اگر شما از دید از زاویه زمان تکرار، از زاویه وجود بهش نگاه کنید، یه فکری بسیار منسجمیه در خودش و با تمام شاعرای دیگه فرق میکنه و اگر هم چنین اقبالی در غرب داشت به همین دلیله که فیتزجرالد تونست اینو منتقل کنه.
Dick Davis is a leading authority in the study of medieval Persian poetry. Do you think one of the reasons why the rubaiyat became important in the middle of 19th century was because it was the right time for that kind of poetry?
Absolutely. There is so much in the poems of Khayyam that spoke to Victorian England. Questioning your faith, that was a new thing in Victorian England. The sense of, Darwin and the geologists were opening up the sense that there's an enormous amount of time before this civilization. That is there in Persian poetry. It's there in Khayyam's quatrains. It was new in England. In England, there was a sense that the past was not very long, and we knew it all. Everything was known. In Khayyam, you have this sense there is this vast unknown stretch of time. Fitzgerald is able to put that into verse and to make it available to everybody. So it's not a thing that only intellectuals know. It's a thing that anybody who can read poetry knows.
Since its publication, there has been an ongoing debate about Fitzgerald's rubaiyat. How much was a translation and how much was Fitzgerald's own creation?
But we should view him both as a translator and as the creator of an original work. Because after all, it's well known that he reshaped the rubaiyat. In Persian, all of these rubaiyat are grouped together and not in any way. They're just alphabetically. They're stacked, aren't they, as if it was in some sort of store. Fitzgerald has taken them out and put them into a really beautifully extended and curved line of narrative.
افسوس که بی فایده فرسوده شدی و از داس سپهر سرنگون سوده شدی در داغ و ندامتا که تا چشم زدی نابوده به کام خویش نابوده شدی.
Edward Fitzgerald died in 1883 at the age of 74. He is buried in a modest grave in southern England. At the side of his grave is a rose planted by the English Omar Khayyam Club in 1893. It was a cutting from the rose tree at Omar Khayyam's tomb. I am sure Fitzgerald would have been very pleased with this connection to his old friend Khayyam. The English connection with Omar Khayyam continues today. I'm at this special ceremony taking place in Neshabur. This is a statue of Edward Fitzgerald, and they're going to unveil it in a few minutes' time to honor Edward Fitzgerald's translation of Rubaiyat into English 150 years ago. This is a statue of Edward Fitzgerald, and they're going to unveil it in a few minutes' time to honor Edward Fitzgerald's translation of Rubaiyat into English 150 years ago.
خیلی زیبا، خیلی قشنگ. احسن به شما ان آدم هنرمندی هستید.
کین صبر که امروز تماشاگه توست فردا همه از خاک تو برخواهد رست.
Over 900 years after his death, Omar Khayyam remains a significant figure in modern-day Iran. But what is it about his poetry that still speaks to Iranians today?
در واقع بستگی داره به دوره‌ای که و تیپی که سراغ خیام میرفته. خیام و از آدم‌های اندیشمندی مثل دکتر شایگان رفتن سراغش و مقاله نوشتن، تا راننده اتوبوسی که تو جیبش رباعیات هست و میخونه و سرشار از سرخوشی یا سرشار از آنچه که باید رها کرد و از اینکه تلاش تغییر آنچنانی از جهان رو در ذهنش داشته رها کنه و بپذیر واقعیت موجود رو. این کمک هم میکرده.
در این دوره مشکلی نبوده؟ از نظر حکومتگران؟
ممکنه که بسیاری از دیدگاه‌های رسمی با اندیشه های خیام یا مولانا موافقتی نداشته باشن، ولی به علت نفوذ اینها در خاطره جمعی ملت ایران انقدر قوی بوده که خود به خود نمیتونسته همچین اتفاقی بیفته، یا اگرم میافتاده هیچ اثری در محدود بلکه شکوفا شدنش پیش میاد.
Omar Khayyam's influence spread far and wide. His philosophy appealed to Persians from the 11th century and to Europeans and Americans from the time of the 19th century translation of his poetry by Edward Fitzgerald. For me, as a Persian, I take pride in what Omar Khayyam stood for. A questioning of certainties, a refusal to